Welcome to today's program on Plant Incorporated Protectant, or PIP, Insect Resistance Management Draft Proposal. The proposal was developed from guidance provided by the 2018 FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel that assessed the risks of resistance of lepidopteran pests to Bt pips. This webinar is produced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Pesticide Programs. My name is Alan Reynolds, and I'm in the Biopesticides and Pollution Prevention Division, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. One disclaimer, the views expressed by our presenters are for educational purposes only and do not represent the official views or positions of EPA. Before we begin our presentation today, please note that today's webinar is for informational purposes and the agency will answer clarifying questions on the proposal. However, comments and questions submitted in the webinar today cannot be officially considered by the agency. If you want to formally comment on the proposal, please submit your comments through the docket. And our next speaker will be providing additional information on how to do that. I'd like to introduce our presenter today. Kara Welch is an entomologist with EPA's Biopesticide Pollution Prevention Division. Her work at EPA has been focused on pesticide risk management and scientific analyses underpinning pesticide regulation of emerging technologies. Her areas of expertise include resistance management, pesticide benefits, and ecological risk assessments. Kara received her master's degree in entomology from the University of Arizona, where she first became familiar with insect resistance management issues. And with that, I will turn it over to Kara.
Thanks, Alan. I'll be presenting information today contained within our recently published draft proposal regarding improvements for the terms of registration for Bt corn and cotton concerning lepidopteran and insect resistance management. Before we go ahead and get started, I wanted to make a quick housekeeping note that I'll be shortening lepidopteran to LEP at certain points during the presentation and insect resistance management to IRM. For an outline of what I'll be going through, firstly, a background on the initiatory phases of our project, and then I'll review the components of our proposed IRM changes and the feedback we're requesting from stakeholders like yourselves. And finally, invite you to provide comments through our docket process and let you know what happens before our final decision is made. Regarding the background of this project, the agency became aware of resistance cases from multiple lepidopteran pests of Bt corn and cotton, and we determined that the current IRM plan, known as the High Dose Refuge Strategy, which I'll explain in subsequent slides, is inadequate for these pests. EPA has a goal of preserving Bt pips as a public good due to their low environmental impact and historically high efficacy. However, lepidopteran pests have provided a notable challenge to the current IRM conventions because of their unique pest biology. The poster child of our project is Helicoverpesea, also known as corn earworm or cotton bollworm. This pest affects two Bt crops, both corn and cotton, as its common name implies, and therefore is under quite a bit of Bt selection nearly year-long, which adds to the complexity of creating a lasting IRM plan. Bt corn specifically is a selective funnel for resistance in this pest, because corn earworm feeds there first, then all subsequent generations have a higher resistance profile before they move into Bt cotton, and then overwinter. The impact of resistance has been most prominent in the southeastern cotton belt, where both corn and cotton overlap substantially and high rates of overwintering occur. Given these and other challenges, EPA decided to host a FIFRA SAP. FIFRA SAP, FIFRA of course being the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. SAP is a scientific advisory panel which is allowable under this specific law. These are convened by the EPA to gather expert advice of independent scientists. And this was done so here regarding improvements to LEP IRM for Bt crops. To initiate the panel, EPA developed a white paper on this topic and set forth charge questions for the panel to answer at a convened time and date. After the panel met, the EPA was provided with meeting minutes, formal guidance by the panel. And you can see our timeline from initiation of the project through the panel to where we are today here. Our issues paper was put in the public docket in May of 2018. In July of that year, we held our SAP. In October, the final meeting minutes were delivered to the EPA, and we had a period of stakeholder engagement. After this deliberation period, our draft proposal published on September 8th, 2020 in our docket. Before we get into the details of the Lepidoptera and IRM framework, I wanted to bring your attention to similarities with a previous proposal and decision process EPA has gone through regarding IRM, which formed the backbone of our stepwise process here for Lepidopteran pests. Precedence was set for the LEP SAP by a previous IRM overhaul for a coleopteran pest, corn rootworm. There are many similar factors and resistance that arose for corn rootworm as with Lepidopteran resistance, but the pest biology is significantly different, which initiated EPA to host a separate panel regarding LEP resistance. Risk factors for both pests include lack of high dose of BT active against rootworm or Lepidopterans, limited effectiveness of refuge plantings, and other similarity factors we'll go through on subsequent slides. You can see here we had a timeline similar to the one I just presented where a SAP was held. There was a period of stakeholder engagement and deliberation and final IRM plan in subsequent years. I will be going through the main resistance factors considered by the SAP panel and the primary background information regarding Lepidopteran resistance, which include lack of high dose, lack of refuge compliance, non-functional multi-protein BT plants, and non-standard field damage indicators for growers to report resistance concerns. I'll be going over each of these in detail. They're also detailed extensively in our white paper, which is in the docket, which will provide a docket number 2 on a subsequent slide. Our first resistance factor is lack of high dose. A high dose of BT toxin was not achieved in any of the 3 Lepidopteran resistance cases discussed in the agency white paper. We're primarily discussing corn earworm, as I mentioned before, but our proposal also includes fall armyworm and western bean cutworm. And again, for none of these pests just named was a high dose of BT toxin attained. As a reminder, high dose is defined as 25 times the concentration required to kill susceptible insects. The idea being that if that dose is achieved, there'll be very few insect survivors, and those survivors will need to carry 2 copies of the resistance trait to be able to survive this very high dose. That covers the high dose part of the high dose refuge strategy that I alluded to earlier. In addition to a high dose, BT crops are planted with a refuge. This is an area of non-BT plants, which support population growth of susceptible insects. The idea being that any of these rare rising resistant individuals that manage to survive the high dose of BT toxin will be likely to mate with susceptible insects arising from the refuge. These offspring will carry thus only 1 copy of the resistance gene, not 2, and be unlikely to survive the high dose in subsequent generations. But for the pests we'll be discussing today, corn earworm, fall armyworm, western bean cutworm, this high dose was not met. Further undermining our high dose refuge strategy is key breakdown of the second tenet, the lack of refuge. I'll review the 2 types of refuge we have for BT crops. Firstly, a structured refuge, which you can see pictured here in the lower left-hand side, where here in blue, a portion of the field is planted to non-BT crops in a designated area in near proximity to the BT field, shown here in green. This is called a structured refuge. The second type of refuge that's common is refuge in a bag. Here you can see a bag of seed corn, and unlike in a structured refuge where you would go over the field once with BT and a second time with non-BT, in this refuge in a bag strategy, you would have BT corn pre-mixed with non-BT in the same seed bag. And again, you can see depicted here in a field of corn, you would have many green, which indicates BT in this instance, plants, and also many red non-BT plants in a field. In high-risk areas like the southern US, where I mentioned you have this overlap of corn and cotton, you have high likelihood of overwintering for these Lepidopteran pests. These rib plantings are also associated with a nearby structured block refugia. So you can imagine this little blue square being planted conjunct with our rib diagram there. Note, refuges are only required for Bt corn, not Bt cotton. And while refuge would normally support a high population of susceptible individuals to dilute any arising resistance genes, as I mentioned, there's low compliance with the planning of block refuges for Lepidopteran pests. This is depicted in detail here. You can see in the table on the left, specifically for southern corn growers where resistance concerns are high, there is low refuge compliance, and it's been on an apparent downward trend through the timeline of this table, 2017. You can see here in 2016, as few as 7% of growers fully meeting our refuge requirement, 19% in 2017. And thus, two key foundations of EPDA's high-dose refuge strategy are undermined for Lepidopteran pests. I'll go through some more complicating factors, including multi-toxin crops known as pyramids not functioning necessarily the way they were intended. Pyramid crops are a Bt-traded crop that express more than one Bt protein targeting the same pest. In the 1990s, both Bt corn and cotton were initially commercialized containing one toxin active against Lepidoptera, and later registrants brought forth plants that produced more than one Bt crop within the same plant targeting at the same pest. These crops function by a strategy known as redundant killing, meaning that if an insect is resistant to one toxin, it will be killed by the other. However, pyramid crops contain proteins that were made available for use during the initial commercialization of Bt plants, and thus the newly commercialized toxins are highly similar to the originally registered proteins. So not only do pyramid plants contain the same toxins that were originally registered in the mid to late 90s, but the ones that were subsequently registered are highly structurally similar. Therefore, this redundant killing paradigm doesn't always come into play. There are still some single trait hybrids of Bt corn available on the market that can lead to the downfall of these different pyramid registrations. You can see in our diagram here, you might have this functional pyramid crop depicted by our intact pyramid, but single traits can lead to a stepping stone of this crumbling of the redundant killing paradigm. I'll be referring to these multi-toxin or pyramid crops as non-functional pyramids for the ones that do not comply with our redundant killing strategy. Lastly, our final major resistance factor that we'll be discussing in the presentation today is a barrier to adequate resistance detection early on. We have had historically poor resistance monitoring, largely due to no set field damage thresholds for Lepidopteran pests. Prior to this proposal, where we're putting forth a new way to monitor for Lepidopteran resistance, resistance was and still will be conducted by industry, but it was done through bioassays and reports of field damage. However, the bioassays are not often sensitive tools for non-high dose insect pests, and there was no set regulatory criterion for how much field damage was an indicator of pest resistance. Thus, without these clear triggers to define pest resistance, the agency has been largely hamstrung on when to bring in regulatory mitigation for resistance management. Thus, with all these resistance factors defined, which was done in our white paper, which again is on regulations.gov, EPA hosted a scientific advisory panel, an SAP, and we used the information garnered from those expert scientists to develop a draft proposal to amend the terms of registration for Bt pips. The draft BPPD proposal includes mitigation options with wide support. We anticipate wide support for the half of the proposal that includes our mitigation options, but there's a second half of the proposal where we are still seeking stakeholder engagement and feedback on complex options before going forward with them. The comment period for the proposal will run from the initiation of the docket, which was on September 9th through November 9th, and is available at docket ID EPA HQ OPP 2019-0682 on regulations.gov. Next, I'll be reviewing what's contained within the proposal. As I mentioned, or alluded to at least on the last slide, there are two key components of the Lepidopteran IRM framework that we're putting forth. There is a mitigation section where we have broad anticipated stakeholder support, and a complex mitigation options section where we're still actively seeking and hoping to engage a good number of stakeholders on these complex ideas. So for the first half, areas with anticipated broad stakeholder support include our proposed resistance definition, a new means of monitoring for resistance, new communication plan, enhanced field triggers, and modifications to the annual reports that are currently submitted by industry to the EPA. In the second section, the complex options for comment area, there is a phase down of certain products discussed, increased refuge and seed blend products discussed, and enhanced refuge compliance monitoring. So to quickly review, our Lepidopteran IRM overhaul process and our outlined proposal, which I'll be discussing shortly, is highly similar to IRM decisions that were made in the past for corn rootworm. The corn rootworm framework is also a collaboration with IRM and IPM, IPM being integrated pest management, and included similarities like product phase down, changes to resistance monitoring, new best management practices. And overall, the corn rootworm IRM proposal was seen as a success by the agency, in large part due to stakeholder engagement and negotiations with our partners in various fields. We'll begin by reviewing EPA's newly proposed resistance definition for Lepidopteran pests. As mentioned, EPA's previous resistance definition was reliant on bioassays and field triggers that were either inconclusive or undefined. Now EPA is proposing a two-tiered definition of resistance. The first level of resistance is heightened practical resistance. This is assumed for all non-high dose pests. For such pests at the registration of a new BT PIP, the EPA will set forth monitoring via sentinel plots. I'll explain what those are on a subsequent slide. Best management practices, or BMPs, implemented at commercialization, and mandatory refuge compliance visits are also introduced. I'll explain quite a bit more about what these specific mitigations are on subsequent slides. The second level of resistance definition is practical resistance. This will be linked to specific levels of field damage. I'll also refer to these as UXI, or unexpected injury. And following UXI, additional BMPs will be relayed alongside a new comms plan. For sentinel plots, this is a key part of our monitoring for practical resistance development. EPA proposes to collaborate with industry on outlining fields of BT corn planted across high-risk areas that will be scouted to monitor for set field damage triggers. Sentinel plots will be planted under conditions most attractive to corn pests and act as an early warning of resistance if possible. One of the biggest pushes of the proposal is also to incorporate IPM with IRM. This will be largely done through best management practices and changes to the communication model between EPA, industry, and growers. When practical resistance occurs, we have a series of BMPs for the current growing season, as well as subsequent growing seasons after unexpected injury has been detected to limit the spread of resistance. We've gone over our new resistance definition, sentinel plots, and changes to our mitigation and communications plan. Next, we'll be going through our complex options that we're actively seeking comment on, not formally proposing at this time. This includes our product phase down, the refuge increase in pyramid products, and changes to our refuge compliance monitoring program. EPA is asking for feedback on a short-term phase down of single trait corn products and a long-term phase down of non-functional pyramid products. This has been previously done where single trait products were phased out for corn rootworm. And note they're still being actively phased down in a long-term collaboration with our industry partners. For the phase down for products for lepidopteran single traits or non-functional pyramids. This is not a phase down necessarily to zero acreage. This will include areas where plantings are done in high-risk regions for a shorter term phase down, like the South, but will exclude areas where niche markets of specific types of corn are needed or the risk might be less. EPA is also seeking comment on an increase in refuge and rib products. I explained earlier that you have these bags of seed corn known as rib plantings, which include a certain percentage of BT and a certain percentage of non-BT. Currently, there's a 5% refuge in these seed blend or refuge in a bag products. We're asking for feedback regarding an increase to a 10% rib nationwide, while maintaining the block refuge in the South. Finally, EPA is seeking comment on changes to the refuge compliance program. The first option is requiring mandatory on-farm visits by industry for growers planting structured block refuge. Secondly, asking industry to restrict grower access to BT technology for 2 years if growers are found out of compliance with block refuge standards. Thirdly, requiring seed dealers to maintain a high sign rate for grower agreements to the IRM program. And fourth, asking industry to provide documentation that high enough quality refuge seed is available for growers who do make use of block refuge technology. This concludes the proposed changes and requests for feedback contained within the draft Lepidopteran IRM document. EPA is expecting a high level of stakeholder interest in our proposal. Again, the comment period runs through November 9th. And you can read our document in full and all of the documents that went into the deliberation of our current proposal on regulations.gov at docket ID EPA HQ OPP 2019-0682. That includes the SAP meeting minutes and other documents that were submitted during our deliberation phase, including the proposal. Once our comment period is over, we will be working in collaboration with EPA management as well as agri-industry to negotiate changes to the IRM framework. We'll be incorporating the comments we received during the comment period and ultimately coming out with a final decision memo in the coming fiscal year to detail the final changes to the Lepidopteran IRM strategy, which will also be published on regulations.gov. That concludes my presentation, and I'm going to hand it back over to Alan to moderate questions.
Thanks, Kara. That was a terrific presentation on the draft proposal. So now we're going to move to the question and answer portion. First question that we've received is, when is the deadline to submit a comment on this proposal? The comment period runs through November 9th. And the docket number, it was provided on the previous slide, and it is accessible through regulations.gov. This is also a good reminder. We can certainly provide clarifying answers to your questions today, but we highly recommend that you submit your comments, your ideas, your counter proposals formally into the docket so that they can be officially considered by the agency. I'm going to move on to the next question. How was high dose definition developed? I'll go ahead and answer this since I'm a bit of an old timer at the agency. The high dose concept was actually developed by a scientific advisory panel in 1998. And as Kara explained in her slide, the definition that we've had is 25 times the level of toxin needed to kill susceptible insects. And so what that essentially ensures is that all susceptible genotypes, the SS genotype, will be killed by that toxin expression, as well as heterozygote genotypes. Those would be genotypes with one resistance allele and one susceptible allele. Those would also be killed by the high dose. So the only thing that would be able to survive the high dose would be a truly resistant individual with 2 resistance alleles, which we would expect to be very rare in the population. As Kara explained, the high dose refuge paradigm has been our goal with BT PIPS resistance management really since that 1998 SAP. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. What actions has EPA or the registrant taken to promote compliance with the registration's refuge requirements? And why haven't those actions worked? Kara, I'm going to toss this question to you.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if there's a very specific answer. As you could see in one of my earlier slides, we've had that downward trend in southern corn grower compliance. And again, this is specifically with block refugia. There's a perceived lack of yield with planting a 20% refuge. We've heard that there's a lack of capacity to obtain elite refuge hybrids. This could impact compliance. Steps we've taken to promote compliance has been asking our industry partners to increase communications with growers, and I know that they have undergone some campaigns to increase grower compliance. Alan, do you have any other specific measures?
As part of the terms of registrations for BT PIPs, there's what we call a compliance assurance program, and it outlines a number of measures that each registrant has to take to ensure compliance with the refuge requirements. Those include things such as site visits, where there would be an on-farm assessment whether a refuge has been planted. Those are done yearly on a sample of the growers who have purchased that particular product from the company, and they'll be then subject to an on-farm visit or a possible on-farm visit for refuge compliance. Most of the other aspects of the compliance assurance program focus on education, making sure that growers understand what they need to do, making sure that they're provided with educational materials such as a grower guide that clearly lay out the resistance management requirements for them. So these are all part of the terms of registration. The larger issue of the why they haven't worked, that's a good question, one we've been discussing in the agency for a number of years. I think, largely from a grower's perspective, there can be a disincentive to plant refuge, particularly when a structured refuge that has to be managed separately from the BT field. That creates an extra burden on the grower. They can also suffer a lower yield in refuge acres and have other logistical issues with the refuge. So there are cases where just growers have been resistant to planting refuges. But part of the proposal here, we are certainly interested in if there are new ideas, better ways of going about refuge compliance, we're certainly interested in hearing those. And this next question actually contains a bit of a comment, so I'm going to read the question part here, but I would highly encourage the questioner to submit this comment to the docket so that it can be considered. The question is, in 2007, the EPA approved a natural refuge for IRM regarding Bollgard 2. This was approved despite the fact that there was no high dose for HZEA. Was this done strictly to improve farmer compliance? Certainly, farmer compliance was part of that decision-making process. Going to a natural refuge that is not managed like a structured refuge is certainly something that farmers were in favor of, given that it took the compliance aspect of refuge out of the picture. It certainly was not the sole consideration. We looked very closely at the risks of resistance using natural refuge. There was a lot of data and research done to support that effort. We also took the concept of natural refuge before another scientific advisory panel in 2006 and followed their guidance in implementing the natural refuge. Those materials from that SAP are available on EPA's website. I would highly encourage the questioner to go back and look at that SAP report, and I think that'll provide a lot of good background on the natural refuge and the types of considerations that we used to ultimately approve natural refuge for BT cotton.
Additionally, that decision is re-reviewed regularly.
Yes, and we do regular reassessments on it, so thanks for reminding me there. This question is, has EPA considered ending the single trait BT PIP registrations? If not, why not? So Kara, I will send that to you.
So as I mentioned towards the end, we are considering a product phase down to close to possibly zero acreage of single trait BT corn hybrids. The agency has previously worked with industry to remove single trait BT cotton products from the market. They were no longer holding so much of a market share. But for single trait BT corn, that is something we are asking for feedback on within our current document that's out for assessment. We see benefit in no longer having single traits being available on the market to create a stepping stone towards resistance to pyramid products, but we understand that these may serve a important market value in some regions or present less risk in certain areas. So we are seeking feedback, hoping to obtain that through our public comment period.
Thanks, Kara. I'll also emphasize that EPA has not taken a formal position on the phase down that was presented. As Kara said, it's out for comment, so we would highly encourage stakeholders to comment on that option in the proposal. We're going to move to the next question. Is there resistance of European corn borer to the single trait VT traits? And Kara, again, I'll send that to you.
In the United States, there is not currently any documented resistance for European corn borer for the single trait products. However, our partners in Canada had an incident in the last year regarding European corn borer resistance to single trait corn hybrids containing Cry1F.
Thanks, Kara. Okay, we'll move on. Does the phase down still leave an acreage cap?
I believe there is an acreage cap discussed in the proposal. We would be amenable to changing that specific acreage cap or considering regionally specific acreage caps. Again, the phase down is not something the agency's taken a specific stance on yet. We're asking for feedback, and that information would be great to receive during our comment period about what specific acreage cap might be most amenable to our stakeholder base.
Thanks, Kara. Okay, our next question is, how is UXI defined, or unexpected injury defined?
So unexpected injury, and that's our trigger for field damage. In the proposal, our unexpected injury levels for both corn and cotton are fairly tightly associated with the economic threshold level for the lepidopteran pests of concern. Again, we'll be taking feedback on whether that's a useful indicator, whether it should be higher or lower, something the agency is interested in hearing on as well.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question is, could you please explain how EPA assessed resistance to single mode of action products in non-cotton growing areas?
This is detailed quite a bit in our original white paper, the reasons that plants could be at risk in non-cotton growing areas when they're single trait. Helicoverpesea in particular is a migratory pest, so resistance arising in the south might not be limited to that locality. These pests are quite mobile. And again, single trait crops have been around since the mid-90s, sometimes with the exact same Bt protein incorporated into the corn. And after nearly a 25-year run, these plants are certainly exposing pests to quite a bit of selection pressure throughout the year and over many continuous years. There's additional factors beyond just the migratory pattern of the pest, the non-high dose, and the long-term selectivity and high pressure of these plants. But I think those are the few major resistance factors that I would highlight that the EPA is concerned about for single trait corn hybrids outside of the South. Do you have anything to add to that, Alan?
Great explanation, Kara. I'd also just point out, I think our white paper is available in the SAP docket. It's not in the proposal docket. If anybody is interested in our white paper and can't find it readily, please reach out to Kara or myself and we'll send you the link right away. Our next question here is, will the extent of phase down for single trait corn or pyramid corn cotton varieties be voluntary? I.e., is there a more specific percentage EPA wants to see?
Again, this is not something the agency has taken a specific stance on and something we're highly amenable to change about. But for the single trait varieties, I think we would have a lower threshold than for non-functional pyramids, in the same way that we have a shorter time frame for a phase down of the single traits as for the pyramids. But again, no conclusive decision has been made on this, and we understand it's an issue that is of importance to many of our stakeholders.
Thanks, Kara. And again, we highly encourage comment on these complex options. So we're really looking for feedback from stakeholders. So please do comment. Our next question is, how do you define niche markets for single traits?
Niche markets for single traits would largely be defined by our experience with corn rootworm. There were some specialty varieties of single trait corn that were allowed to have an extended phase down timeline. I'm not sure the extent to which I can speak about this, since it does impact certain companies differently than others and is therefore somewhat confidential, but niche markets of corn outside of your generic yellow feed corn. Alan, do you want to expand on those specific varieties?
I don't think we have worked up an official EPA resistance management definition of a niche crop. As you said, Kara, that's how we thought of them so far. Next question is, as currently contemplated, would it be possible for the utility of single mode of action events deployed outside cotton growing regions to potentially be extended beyond the phase down timeframe? Under the proposed draft guidance, could a phase down process be assessed individually for each event?
Again, just emphasizing anything related to our phase down process is not being formally proposed, but is out for comment. We would certainly take comment on the extension of single trait or non-functional pyramids outside of the high-risk area, as stakeholders are concerned about these. In the past, when we were considering our phase out and phase down process for rootworm, this was done registration by registration, more or less. So we would likely follow that same outline if and only if we do proceed with that part of the proposal following our stakeholder feedback period.
Thanks, Kara. And again, I would emphasize these are the types of ideas and concepts that would be great to be submitted officially through the docket for our consideration. Next question is, how will the rib change, 10% rib, address the growing body of research showing that rib can speed pest resistance in ear-feeding insects by presenting them with a mosaic of BT expressing kernels and very little pure non-BT refuge?
There's quite a bit of detail on this within the meeting minutes provided by the SAP. One of our panelists, I believe it was Tony Ives, presented a model of resistance that included various rib levels, and I believe did incorporate mosaics of different toxin expression within kernels. Our 10% threshold is in our proposal and out for comment. Because of that model, that was our primary source for that information for the SAP, but also additional stakeholder feedback received during our deliberation period that this was about the threshold that our grower representatives would find tolerable, the uppermost level tolerable to yield concerns. But again, that is something the EPA has been concerned about through the white paper and the entirety of the process. The mosaic nature of toxin expression in BT corn ears that won't be fully resolved by an increase in rib percentage.
Thanks, Kara. Okay, our next question. Does the proposed framework address restriction of VIP in corn in the South or restriction of blended refuge in the South?
So our current proposal for rib has an increase to 10% rib nationwide while maintaining a block refuge in the South as well. That'll be held at the same level. There is no current BT protein specific restriction proposed.
Our next question, under the Lepidopteran IRM guidance, could use of a chemical insecticide constitute an acceptable second mode of action with a single mode of action PIP?
There's several challenges to having a foliar insecticide as a second mode of action. I can think of a few. That this would have to be a highly targeted timed spray, since it'd be difficult to spray once the insects have moved within the corn ear. It would have to be done at the egg stage when the eggs are still on the tassel or neonates are just emerging. But we are proposing within our best management practices that we formulated with the SAP and in conjunction with some industry documents that were submitted to EPA and are in the docket for review during our deliberation period. But following identification of practical resistance, we do recommend using foliar sprays as they can best be done to prevent overwintering populations or the explosion of resistant populations in subsequent years. But it is not currently being considered as a second mode of action for single trait hybrids, although if the commenter wants to expand on how that might be possible or incorporated into our best management practices, taking that into further detail in our comment period would be something we'd be interested in.
Thanks, Kara. Another clarifying question, I think this is actually related to a previous one. Is the increase in the refuge in rib from 5% to 10% for all BT products or only those that contain VIP? I think, Kara, you clarified that earlier and said that it applies to all BT products. Is that correct?
Yeah. The increase in rib percentage will be for all BT rib products nationwide.
We have a second part to this question, and that is, what were the shortcomings of the 5% rib that the 10% rib will solve?
Again, I would, for the details of how this decision was made, direct the commenter to our SAP meeting minutes, where the model that we based this on was discussed in detail in the meeting minutes submitted by our panel. And then the increase in refuge is to hopefully provide a bigger pool of susceptible insects for rare arising resistant insects to mate with.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question, and this is related to a previous high dose question we had, should the definition of high dose be focused on killing 100% of heterozygotes, the SR genotype, rather than homozygotes, SS? Kara, do you want to take a first crack at this one?
Sure, I think that could be amenable. I don't think we would achieve 100% killing of the susceptible insects. Is that what you said?
100% killing of the heterozygote.
That may or may not be a more practical way to define resistance, but it would be hard to, first of all, generate a resistant strain and then generate a heterozygous F1 population and conduct those tests prior to registration. There's some practical limitations to defining resistance that way, in my opinion.
Under our current high dose definition, you would be killing almost all heterozygotes. It was unlikely to be 100%. So I think this would be interesting to look at the currently registered PIPs and see if any of them would meet a standard of a 100% heterozygote kill. I think it's an interesting question. And again, I would encourage concepts like this to be submitted formally through the docket as a comment. Next question. Is the producer who is not compliant with refuge requirements prohibited from purchasing BT products from all companies offering BT products?
That's a good question. Currently, for practical reasons, I think that the grower who is out of compliance with the refuge standards would only be blocked from obtaining seed from the company they originally bought from in the year they weren't compliant. I don't think there is a practical way to deter that grower from purchasing from other companies for some various legal reasons. Alan, do you have anything to expand on that?
There's antitrust issues that could possibly be involved there. I don't know that it's legally possible to maintain a industry-wide list of growers who don't comply. As you mentioned, Kara, I think there's some legal challenges there. So our current compliance assurance program is really based on a non-compliant grower being prohibited from purchasing products from that particular company. There are legal reasons for that. Our next question is, please tell me how to submit to the docket. What you'll need to do is go to the website regulations.gov, and it's pretty easy to navigate. The easiest way to find it is to search using the docket number, EPA-HQ-OPP-2019-0682. And that's what you would search under regulations.gov, and it will pull up the docket with the proposal. And there's a convenient button to comment, and you basically just click that button and there'll be an interface for you to go ahead and submit your comment. I think you can also attach documents like a PDF file, a Word file, things like that. So it is relatively flexible and should be fairly easy to do. There's also help available on that site if you're having trouble submitting your comment. On to the next question here. How do the different computer models used to predict the longevity of a BT PIP product indicate that the various new regulatory options being proposed will affect durability?
That's a great question. We, again, base this largely off of the SAP's model to increase at least rib refuge percentage. However, the agency does not currently have the capacity to conduct any simulations or new modeling on our own. So any kind of detailed modeling publications, papers, comments would be well received by the agency that incorporate our new proposed or out for comment conditions.
Hey, thank you, Kara. Our next question is, please clarify how traits in the Corn Belt affect resistance evolution in H-Zea that does not overwinter.
I think my answer here would be just the long-term selection pressure of these single trait hybrids that have been around since the mid-1990s through today many years later, have generally increased the resistance profile of pests like Helicobacter nationwide. I understand that insects that don't overwinter in the north may not be contributing to that population hardly at all, but the long-term selection for these plants over many years and the cross resistance to closely related toxins have decreased the efficacy of toxins that already weren't high dose. Alan, do you want to add to that?
Certainly, we're worried about Zea resistance in areas where it would overwinter and there's high selection pressure, but traits are not just restricted to the Corn Belt. Corn is certainly grown in the South, and it's part of the selection that Zea will experience in areas where it does overwinter. So those traits are grown, wherever corn is grown, and it's something that we need to consider. I'm going to move on. Will the new proposed impact extend to biological BT products in any way? So I think the question is referring to, will anything we're proposing here impact microbial BT products? Is my assumption that the question is referring to here. And the answer to that is no. This proposal is specific to BT pips, corn and cotton. Our next question is, does phase down mean phase out? Kara, I will send this your way.
Again, the phase down is for comment, not formally being proposed by the agency, but we were very specific in our verbiage. And no, this is intended to be a phase down and not a complete phase out. It's also completely out for public comment right now and is not formally being proposed, but the verbiage was intended to convey a phase down and not a phase out.
Thanks, Kara. Next question. If we have seed blends in the South, how will we know whether we are counting UXD on BT or non-BT ears? Does everyone need quick strips?
That's a good point. I think this will be field damage as assessed over the field as a whole in the rib, not including the block refuge area in the South. But I think that would be something great to include in a comment, how to assess this differently in rib fields, if that's a concern.
Yep, Kara, I'd agree. I think that's one of the big challenges with RIB is doing those field level investigations. So it's a great point. And again, we highly encourage these types of things to be submitted as comments.
And additionally, we will have grower reported UXI is of great interest to the agency. But another component of our proposal that's out for comment right now is the incorporation of these sentinel plot areas, which would be scouted by either industry or extension personnel, and we'll have a clear method for scouting for UXI and field damage to be reported to the agency.
Our next question has two parts. The first part is, with the proposed definition of practical resistance, will EPA publish instances of UXI? Our practice, at least to date, has been that we receive an annual monitoring report for both the corn and cotton traits, and that includes a discussion of cases of UXI that have been investigated. EPA then reviews those annual reports, and EPA's reviews can be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, or we're looking into making them available in our IRM docket. So I think that's a great question and something that we will certainly be considering as we're moving forward and developing this new framework for resistance management. And the second part of the question is, in the event where UXI occurs and field collections cannot or do not occur by industry, how will EPA handle suspected cases of resistance?
Under our new proposed definition, as I mentioned, we've previously had trouble with bioassays, either for obtaining insect collections or for having conclusive results to declare a non-high dose pest as being resistant. Under our new definition, we're largely solely relying on practical resistance being indicated by these field measures, and are considering doing away with these annual assay collections or insect collections to do assays with. I believe in the proposal, a company can refute the idea of practical resistance if an insect collection is made and that population has a certain threshold of susceptibility. But we will no longer be relying on insect bioassays as an indicator of resistance in the proposal as it's written today. Of course, again, subject to comment.
This is parallel to what we did with corn rootworm a few years ago, and Kara, you walked through that in your presentation. But basically, with resistance monitoring, we have a scenario where UXI is the trigger for action. So when a UXI level is exceeded, that would kick in the need for best management practices, use of alternate controls, those types of things to try to manage what could be a potentially resistant population. We're not sure because we don't have bioassay confirmation, but this is we feel, a very proactive way to try to manage what could be a potentially resistant population. The next question, what is the size of the structured refuge to pair with a rib product in the South?
Right now, we're asking for comment about a 5% rib product area, whereas now it's currently 5%. And the structured refuge in the South will be maintained at a 20% block refuge in conjunction with that rib planting.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question is regarding non-compliant growers. Doesn't that penalize registrants for a grower's refusal to comply with IRM and allow a grower to be serial non-compliant? The way we have structured the compliance program is that really everything runs through the registrant, and that I think also reflects the nature of how we regulate PIPs. We're regulating the PIP trait and the genetic material necessary to make it. We're not regulating the rest of the corn plant. That's outside the scope of EPA's regulation. So our focus is just on that pesticide part. It's not on the whole corn plant. So because of that dynamic, we primarily work with the registrant to ensure compliance. So the burden is on the registrant, and they're essentially the interface with the grower. They're the interface for all the educational materials, the grower guides, all of the IRM information they'll need. So they're, I think, in a logical position to be able to assess compliance. And in the case of a non-compliant grower, deal with that grower. We feel this creates an incentive for the registrant to work to ensure compliance. The second part of the question, to allow a grower to be serially non-compliant, I think that does point to one of the limitations of what we can do on compliance. We discussed earlier, we cannot create a industry-wide list of non-compliant growers that can be denied the technology. So that being the case, it is certainly possible that a grower could move from one company to another between years. But we have certainly heard, though, that growers can be very loyal to certain hybrids and genetic backgrounds that work well on their farms, and therefore would be reluctant to switch to another company, although that certainly could be possible. Okay, our next question is, when does EPA plan to implement these IRM changes?
With the rootworm process, we had an SAP in 2013 and went forward with our final decision in 2016. In our case, we had a SAP panel for Lepidopteran pests in 2018, and we've issued our proposed framework in 2020. We anticipate a lengthy time of negotiations with stakeholders, industry, digging into the comments and considering them before issuing a final proposal. We don't have a exact time frame for when that'll be, but possibly in the next year.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question, on this note of field level damage, has there been more discussion of implementing Sentinel plot idea, including use of BT sweet corn for this purpose, as proposed by Dively et al., University of Maryland? Yeah. For example, an annual systematic plan for this versus reliance on unexpected damage only?
In general, I think the answer is yes. The Sentinel plot program that is described in the proposal as it stands does prioritize the use of sweet corn for these Sentinel plots. We would anticipate that these Sentinel plots would be maintained in the same locations year to year. They'll be used to measure UXI, but we would hope to maintain them in certain locations and make them as attractive as possible to BT pests. That includes maybe doing a late planting, prioritizing these sweet corn hybrids that are highly attractive to lepidopterans, and other components to make them as much of an early warning indicator as possible, although we are aware at the agency that field damage is not the most actionable means to mitigate resistance, but perhaps the most practical for regulatory concerns.
Great, thanks, Kara. Our next question, are those annual reports on resistance that EPA collects and reviews stored in the FIFRA 6A2 database or in another location, i.e. where would someone direct their FOIA? So the routine annual monitoring reports that the agency gets for each trait, corn and cotton, they're not maintained in the 6A2 database. They're in the Office of Pesticide Programs document database. So any FOIA requests would have to be submitted to the Office of Pesticide Programs for those particular resistance reports or the agency's reviews of those reports. Moving on to our next question. The EPA proposed monitoring using Sentinel plots. What actions are undertaken when UXI thresholds are surpassed in the Sentinel plots?
That's highly detailed in our proposal, but these are generally the measures that occur at this practical resistance phase, which include BMP recommendations for the current and subsequent growing seasons, and an enhanced communication strategy to growers in the surrounding counties to alert nearby producers of the resistance event. I think those are the two primary ones.
Thanks, Karen. Next question is, if all BT corn pyramids have to contain VIP, and then these are sold as 10% rib, won't this drive resistance of Western bean cutworm like crazy?
I'm assuming the commenter is discussing a post-phase down reality, where if the products that are outlined in the for comment section of our proposal do move forward, most hybrids would contain VIP. We're anticipating that an increase in rib allotment would be protective of Western bean cutworm, which doesn't currently have its own IRM plan per se. But the agency would be interested in means to which this wouldn't be or would be effective means for resistance mitigation for Western bean cutworm.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question is, what is the difference between a bioassay and F2 screen if EPA is not relying on bioassays?
Under the current proposal, our practical resistance definition doesn't rely on F2 screens or bioassays. It only relies on unexpected injury.
Yeah, okay, we've had another question come in. Could you please repeat the timeline for when EPA will finalize the framework, and what is the process?
So I'll start with what is the process. Again, currently our comment period runs through November 9th. We're very much looking forward to receiving feedback on our proposal and amending it to come forward with the best possible plan. Following the closure of the comment period, we'll take into account the comments received. We'll be considering those. We'll be negotiating with industry. This is largely ABSTC and its constituent registrants on how best to move forward with the framework that EPA comes out with, considering comments. And we'll be considering how to move best forward again with these industry partners and EPA management. This negotiation period will take an indeterminate amount of time. And when it concludes, we will write a final decision memo to make stakeholders aware of our conclusions. But this could take, I would say, 1 to 2 years based on the corn rootworm precedent, although there's no specific time frame for when this will conclude.
Based on our past experience, we'd be targeting probably within a year or two have a new framework in place. But again, that's not set in stone. Okay, we got another question. How will cases of UXI and Sentinel plots be reported to growers in the area? Is this responsibility thrust solely upon extension?
The information will be conveyed through several means. I'm sure by extension. Alan mentioned earlier that EPA publishes in a separate docket from the one that is currently out for comment, different reports on resistance arisals that as they happen. This will largely be done by industry communication, whether they communicate that to extension or through some kind of campaign. And I think they've done that in the past, or through seed dealers. It's something we can give more details on likely in the final framework. But it's a great point that not relying solely on extension for these resistance determinations or communications, but the burden will also be on industry, and EPA publishes its own reports as well.
So, Kara, I'd also say there is a communication aspect to the proposal that I think addresses this question, at least to some extent. So I don't know if you want to highlight any of that.
Yes, it is a multi-county area that would be alerted. That's what we define as the resistant zone. And I believe there's several different prongs of communication that defined in the proposal that industry can reach out to stakeholders on regarding different resistance, including through extension. And I believe it's the Take Action campaign. which I think might be familiar to growers with different herbicide resistance communications in the past. But it's a multi-pronged approach that doesn't rely solely on extension.
Thanks, Kara. We got another question. If a company is not a member of ABSTC, will it not be able to have a seat at the table? I think it's a bit of a hypothetical question right now. So all of the PIP registrants that have registered products to date are members of ABSTC. So right now, that's the functional consortium group that represents the interests of the industry. But if in the future there were to be a company that had a registered PIP that was not part of ABSTC, they would certainly have a seat at the table. It is not any kind of EPA requirement that a company be a member of ABSTC. We would certainly endeavor to treat that company equally and have basically the same framework in place for that company. It might logistically be a bit more of a challenge, but absolutely not. That they would most assuredly they would have a seat at the table. Another question, with regards to the final framework, would it include part of the proposal where EPA is requesting feedback and where EPA has not taken a position? Example, the phase down and increased RIP.
The final decision memo will likely contain things that is in the proposed area and may contain things that is in the complex mitigation options section. But of course, the entire proposal is out for comment and we can't make any definitive statements about what might be contained in the final decision memo currently.
We're going to have a decision memo, and that decision memo will really explain how we got from the draft proposal that's out for comment now to this final framework. So that'll work through that decision logic when it's ready. Another question has come in. Will any of the current CAP requirements possibly go away in future PIP registrations for LEP active proteins and also monitoring program?
Yes, in general, whatever we conclude in the final framework will impact future registrations of BT or just PIPs in general, at least proteinaceous ones. But I believe there's several components that might impact the compliance assurance program that are in the proposal right now. Ones that I can think of most strongly is changes to, I believe, what was previously called the 2 strikes rule, where a grower could be out of compliance with block refuge for 2 years before losing access to technology. We're asking for comment on the option of having that be 1 year prior to losing access to the technology. And I believe that the seed dealer sign rate, which we're asking to be 95% before a seed dealer might lose access to the technology, is part of the compliance assurance program. And another thing in our complex options area is that idea of industry possibly submitting a report about the availability of non-BT elite corn hybrids for refuge. Also having block refuge sales accompanied by on-farm visits. I think those are the areas that are most impacted in the compliance assurance program. Alan, if you want to add anything.
I think the short answer here is it is certainly possible that aspects of the CAP or the monitoring program could be changed in a final framework. I think we can't comment on that obviously right now while the proposal is still going through comment. So we're going to certainly look very closely at the input we get from stakeholders and the public comments we receive as we refine our proposal and work in negotiations with industry. As to what that final framework will look like, obviously we can't speak to that now, but that it's certainly possible we could have adjustments to both of those in the future. Okay, we got a late question. When would the 3-year phase down start?
It would start following the final decision memo. Again, relying on our experience with corn rootworm. I can expand on that since there's so much uncertainty and we're still taking comments on this LEP program. But again, the final decision for rootworm was issued in 2016, which did have a phase out program for single trait corn active against rootworm. And we are still in a phase down process for that in 2020, 4 years later. So there's a historical precedent for some flexibility in our phase down programs, given grower needs, industry concerns, and is unlikely to be a hard cutoff if it makes its way into the final proposal, which is up for debate.
Thanks, Kara. The EPA recommends BMP of spraying an insecticide when UXI thresholds are surpassed. However, the threshold is surpassed when insects are in the ear which Kara had earlier stated that spraying when the insect has entered the ear is too late. How is spraying an insecticide going to be an effective BMP?
These BMPs for spraying insecticides after determining a resistance threshold wouldn't necessarily, I don't think we'd be so on top of the resistance determination that we would necessarily make it when the insects are still in the ear, although that might be a possibility with the effectiveness of our Sentinel plot program. But these sprays would be targeted to cull overwintering populations later in the year after the insects have moved out of corn, maybe even out of cotton, end of year sprays.
Thanks, Kara. And with that, we can go ahead and conclude the question and answer session. We really appreciate everyone's participation today. Again, I'd like to thank Kara Welch for a really engaging presentation and for her very thorough answer to these questions. And of course, I'd like to thank all of the questioners for providing some really stimulating questions. Again, we highly encourage you to submit your ideas, your counter proposals, other concepts. Please submit them officially through our docket. We will consider everything that we receive, and we're really looking forward to receiving input from various stakeholder groups.